We talk about World War II in terms of strategy, maps, dates, victories, and yes, those things matter. But somewhere in all of that, we lose sight of what it actually felt like to be the man in the ground, the man who hadn't slept in 4 days, the man who watched his best friend die 3 feet away and couldn't even move the body. This video is going to go to some very dark places, places that history books skip over, places that generals never wrote about in their memoirs. I'm going to take you into the mud, the gas, the rats, the psychological collapse, the full, unvarnished truth of what trench warfare did to a human being. Stay until the end, because the final chapter of this story, what happened to these men after the war, that might be the most haunting part of all. Most people think of World War II as a war of movement, blitzkrieg, tank columns rolling across open plains, airborne assaults, naval battles in the Pacific. And for large parts of the war, that's exactly what it was. But there were stretches of this war, years of it, where the front barely moved at all, where men dug into the earth and simply tried to survive. The Italian campaign, the Eastern Front winter lines, the Siegfried Line in the west, the mountains of North Africa. These were not the mobile, cinematic battles we celebrate in movies. These were grinding, static nightmares where progress was measured in meters and paid for in thousands of lives. And here's what most people don't realize. World War II trench conditions in many of these theaters were worse than World War I. The weapons were more powerful, the artillery more precise. The air bombardment, something World War I's soldiers never faced, meant you couldn't just hide below ground and wait. The ground itself could become your tomb. So when we talk about World War II trench warfare, we're not talking about something clean or contained. We're talking about a form of industrialized human suffering that has almost no parallel in history. Let's start at the beginning, with the mud. Imagine waking up. Your first sensation is cold, a deep, bone-penetrating cold that no amount of clothing can fight. Your boots haven't been dry in 11 days. You can't remember what dry feels like. You're lying in roughly 4 inches of standing water at the bottom of a trench that's been dug into clay soil. The walls are slick. Every time it rains, and it rains constantly, the walls inch inward. Men have been buried alive when the sides collapse. And the smell. Veterans who survived these campaigns say the smell never fully left them. It was a combination of wet earth, human waste. Because there are no bathrooms here, just holes in the mud. Rotting food, gun smoke, and the sweet, sickening smell of decomposing flesh. Because the dead didn't always get buried, especially on the Eastern Front. A man could be killed in no man's land, and his body might lie there for weeks. You'd see it every time you looked over the parapet. You'd smell it every hour of the day. Private Harold Fennell, who fought in the Italian campaign near Monte Cassino, wrote home to his mother in 1944. I cannot describe this place. I don't think I should. I will say only that I have begun to believe the earth is not meant for the living. The physical environment alone was enough to break men. But then you add the weapons. World War II artillery had become terrifyingly accurate compared to World War I. The 88mm German gun, one of the most feared weapons of the entire war, could pinpoint a trench position and drop shells directly into it. British and American soldiers called it the 88. When veterans heard that distinctive crack boom, the shell arriving before you heard the gun, many described it as a sound that produced instant, involuntary terror. Not fear, terror. Your body reacted before your mind could. Sergeant James Donahue of the US 36th Infantry Division described sheltering in a slit trench during an artillery barrage near the Rapido River. The ground didn't shake, it convulsed, like it was trying to throw us out. Every shell that hit nearby sent a compression wave through the earth that you felt in your teeth, your chest, your skull. 3 days of that. 3 days. 3 days. No food resupply possible under that fire. No medical evacuation. If you were wounded, you waited. If the man next to you was wounded, you held his hand, and you waited. Coming up, the weapon that veterans said terrified them more than any bullet or shell. Something that killed, not with force, but with silence. And if you've never heard what it was like to be caught in a gas attack in World War II, stay with me, because this will change how you think about chemical warfare forever. The world promised itself after WWII that chemical weapons would never be used again. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 was supposed to be the line. It wasn't. On the Eastern Front, both Soviet and German forces used chemical agents in certain engagements. In the Pacific, Japanese forces used chemical weapons extensively against Chinese troops. And throughout the war, the constant threat of gas, even where it wasn't deployed, was itself a psychological weapon of immense power. Because gas demands a response that is deeply, fundamentally wrong for a human being under stress. When you hear incoming artillery, your instinct is to get your head down, to make yourself small. That's correct. That will save your life. When gas comes, you have to do the opposite. You have to stop. You have to slow your breathing. You have to calmly locate your mask, unfold it without fumbling, and seal it to your face in under 9 seconds. If you fumble, if panic sets in, you inhale. And some of these gases gave you almost no warning at all. Mustard gas, dichlorodiethyl sulfide, was used by German forces at various points on the Eastern Front. It doesn't kill you immediately. That's what makes it so horrible. It's not fast. Mustard gas settles on skin, on fabric, on the walls of trenches. Hours after exposure, sometimes a full day later, the blistering begins. Your skin, your lungs, your eyes. Corporal Anton Müller, a German soldier who described the aftermath of a Soviet gas deployment near Kursk in letters that were declassified decades later, wrote, "The men who were hit did not scream at first. That came later in the field hospital. The screaming came later when they understood what was happening to them. Phosgene was even more insidious, colourless, smelling faintly of cut grass, which is why men sometimes didn't mask in time. It caused pulmonary edema. Your lungs slowly filled with fluid. Men who inhaled a heavy dose might feel relatively fine for 24 to 48 hours, and then drown in their own fluid. The threat of gas meant that soldiers had to sleep in their masks during certain periods. Try to imagine that. Try to sleep in a rubber and glass mask that fogs, that smells of rubber and your own breath, that presses against your face for 8 hours. You can't. You doze in fitful minutes, constantly aware that if the alarm sounds and you don't wake in time, you don't wake up at all. That man in this photograph, he wasn't physically wounded. No bullet, no gas, no shrapnel. But he was broken just as completely as any casualty on a battlefield. What happened to him, and to hundreds of thousands of men like him, is the part of this story that the military didn't want you to know. That's next. In WWII, they called it shell shock. In WWII, the military tried to rebrand it as combat fatigue, partly because the word shock implied the men were simply weak. They weren't. What was happening to these men was the predictable biological result of subjecting a human nervous system to sustained, extreme, uncontrollable terror for weeks, months, sometimes years at a stretch. The numbers are staggering. By some estimates, psychiatric casualties accounted for between 20 and 34% of all American combat casualties in World War II. The British Army discharged over 120,000 men for psychiatric reasons. The Germans had a word for it, Kriegszitten. War trembling. What did it look like? It varied. Some men simply went silent and couldn't be reached, staring at a fixed point for hours, days. Some developed violent, uncontrollable tremors. Some became completely mute. Some laughed, inappropriately, constantly, a symptom doctors found deeply disturbing. Private First Class Thomas Whitaker, who fought with the British 8th Army in North Africa and then Italy, described his breaking point in a post-war account. It wasn't one thing. There was no moment. It was more like, I noticed one morning that I was having a conversation with my sergeant and I couldn't remember anything I'd said, or anything he'd said. I was there and I wasn't there. After that, it got worse. I started to feel like I wasn't real, like I was watching myself from somewhere else. The MO said I needed rest. I was back in the line in 4 days. Back in the line in 4 days. Because the military's approach to psychiatric casualties in World War II was, with some notable exceptions, to rest the man briefly and return him to combat. The logic was both practical and deeply cynical. They couldn't afford to pull men out for mental health treatment. There weren't enough soldiers. General George Patton notoriously slapped a hospitalized soldier he called a coward during the Sicily campaign. A man later diagnosed with severe combat fatigue. Patton was reprimanded. But his attitude was not unique. Psychiatric casualties were viewed by many commanders as a discipline problem, not a medical one. And so men were sent back, again and again, until they either became casualties or the war ended. What we know now, through decades of neuroscience and trauma research, is that what these men experienced was genuine, measurable neurological damage, prolonged cortisol flooding, structural changes to the amygdala and hippocampus. What we now call PTSD wasn't a weakness. It was a wound. They just couldn't see it. We haven't talked about the rats yet, and I know that sounds almost mundane after everything we've covered. But stay with me, because the rats in World War II trenches were not an inconvenience. They were a crisis. And what they did to the men, and sometimes to the dead, is something that most histories leave out entirely. Rats. On the Eastern Front, soldiers described rats the size of small cats, fed on the dead on both sides. They became so bold that they would gnaw on sleeping soldiers. Men woke to find rats attempting to bite their fingers, their faces. They carried disease, leptospirosis, typhus. They contaminated food stores, and they were essentially impossible to eliminate. For every rat killed, more arrived. The trenches and foxholes of the Eastern Front were an endless supply of food for them. But the rats were only one front in a war. Soldiers were fighting against their own bodies. Trench foot, possibly the single most common non-combat injury in static warfare, is what happens when feet are wet and cold for days without relief. The tissue begins to break down, blood flow is cut off, nerve damage sets in. In severe cases, gangrene, amputation. The irony is that trench foot is almost entirely preventable. Dry socks, elevated feet, simple. But in active combat, in trenches under fire, changing your socks wasn't simple. It required stopping. It required exposing yourself. Men who knew they were developing trench foot sometimes couldn't do anything about it for days. The US Army launched aggressive anti-trench foot campaigns during the Italian campaign and the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, where trench foot casualties briefly exceeded combat casualties. Non-commissioned officers were held responsible for their men's feet. Soldiers were ordered to change each other's socks on a schedule. Think about that for a moment. 2 men in a muddy foxhole in Germany, under sporadic artillery fire, taking turns changing each other's socks. Because if they didn't, they'd both lose their feet. Then there was lice. Pediculus humanus corporis, body lice. Nearly universal among soldiers in static positions for more than a few weeks. They laid eggs in the seams of clothing. They caused relentless itching, scratching that broke the skin and invited infection. They also carried typhus, a disease that killed more soldiers in some theatres than combat. Delousing stations existed behind the lines. Soldiers would strip, their clothes would be treated, they'd be powdered. And then they'd go back to the line and be reinfested within a week. Private Luigi Ferrara, an Italian partisan who spent months in mountain positions above the Gothic line, described his experience simply. After a while, you stop noticing the lice. That is when you know something has changed in you, and the body stops complaining because it no longer expects anything better. And then, the war ended, and these men came home, and everyone expected them to simply return to normal life, to families, to jobs, as if what they had seen and survived could just be set aside. What happened to these men after the war? That's the chapter nobody talks about, and I think it might be the most important part of this entire story. They called it the greatest generation, and they were right. These men did extraordinary things under impossible conditions, but heroism and trauma are not mutually exclusive. You can be both brave and broken, and millions of these men came home broken, carrying the trenches inside them. There was no term for it then. PTSD wouldn't be formally recognized by American psychiatry until 1980. In 1945, in 1946, when these men came home, there was nothing, no framework, no language, no treatment. Men who flinched at car backfires. Men who couldn't sleep without waking in a cold sweat. Men who couldn't be in crowds. Men who couldn't explain to their wives why they sometimes went somewhere else in their own minds. Why they were present in the kitchen, but absent somewhere in Italy, or Russia, or Germany. The culture demanded silence. The culture said, "The war is over. Move on. Be grateful." These men had fought for freedom. Now they should enjoy it. Many of them never could. Divorce rates spiked in the late 1940s. Alcoholism among veterans was dramatically elevated. The VA hospitals, underfunded, overwhelmed, had waiting lists years long. Many veterans simply never sought help. They had been trained their whole lives that asking for help was weakness. George Bailey, a US Army veteran who served in the Italian campaign and was interviewed for a 1998 oral history project, said this: "People would ask me what the war was like. I'd say it was rough. They'd nod, say, 'I bet,' and move on. What was I supposed to say? I watched my friend Eddie Marconi bleed out in the mud, calling for his mother. What was I supposed to say to someone asking that at a dinner party?" He never talked about it again. His daughter found those interview tapes after he died. She said she cried for 3 days, not just from grief, but because she finally understood why her father had been so quiet her entire childhood. The trenches didn't end when the soldiers left them. They carried them home. They carried them to their dinner tables and their bedrooms and their silences. And in many cases, they carried them to their graves. These men deserve to be more than footnotes, more than statistics, more than names on monuments that people walk past without stopping. Because understanding what they endured, truly understanding it, not the sanitized version, is the only real way to honor them. And because the way we treat veterans today, the funding we give or don't give to mental health care, the patience we extend or don't extend to men and women who come home changed, that's shaped by whether we understand what the cost of war actually is. Not the cost on a battlefield map, the cost inside a human being. The soldiers in these trenches didn't fight for glory. Most of them will tell you that. They fought because the man next to them needed them to. They endured the cold and the mud and the gas and the rats and the artillery, because leaving meant abandoning the person beside them. That's the thing about trench warfare that never makes it into the history books. It was, in many ways, the most human thing that's ever happened. If this video moved you, if you think these stories deserve to be told, share it. Leave a comment about what struck you most. And if you're new here, this channel exists because these stories matter. Subscribe, and let's keep telling them together. Remember their names.